Welcome to the ClassCast Podcast, where philosophy, policy, pedagogy, and people come together in honest, purposeful conversations about improving school and education for our students and our communities. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens, an award-winning English teacher, speaker, tutor, and podcast host in Northern Virginia. You can listen and subscribe to the ClassCast Podcast on all major streaming services, on YouTube, and at ClassCastPodcast.com. Ladies and gentlemen, class is in session. Welcome to the ClassCast Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. Today, we'll be speaking with Mr. Tyler Rablin, an English teacher, tech coach, sort of anti-grading crusader, probably said that too strongly, and one of the more thoughtful and interesting follows that you might find on Twitter if you're into educational tweets. I'll plug it again at the end, but he's at @MR_Rablin, RABLIN. And so, if you want to get some great ideas about feedback and assessment and grading, in my opinion, he's the guy to go to. So Tyler, thank you for taking the time to speak today. How you doing?
Good. I'm excited to be here. It's fun to see you again and get to talk a little more.
Yeah, cool. So I think I coined the phrase, or said anti-grading crusader, mostly just to be stylistic about it. But how accurate is that? A big part of what we're going to talk about here is grading and assessment. Is it really anti-grading, or is it evolving grading? Where are you? And was that a fair presentation?
I mean, it's pretty accurate to say anti-grading crusader. I feel like I got to somehow use that a little bit now. I like it, but
like business cards.
And it is, I'll put a trademark with your name or something. Because, for me, honestly, the ideal is we don't have grades in the classroom, but it's also most of the work that I do is we operate in a system that does have grades, and how do we make that as meaningful as possible? So, the dream world, yes, it'd be great to not have grades, but that's not the world we live in right now. And so, I think having a grade as the final piece of a course isn't necessarily the most harmful thing in the world. It's sort of a reality. It's a way to sum things up when you have huge schools and you need to make manageable data. Sometimes it is helpful to have that one thing. But I mean, so I don't think it's the end of the world. I talk to so many people who are like, I can't do a gradeless classroom because I have to do a grade at the end. I'm like, yeah, you could do 99.9% of a gradeless classroom and then figure it out at the end. And so, that's where I'm at right now.
Cool. So so you sort of mentioned the conflict between maybe the motivation to go gradeless versus the sort of the practical reality that I work in a school system, almost all school systems, right, that require me to assign a grade. And I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it, right? I mean, until recently, I feel like I had a lot of flexibility in how I graded things. I could grade a homework assignment or not. I could make a test worth whatever I wanted. And in the last few years, my school division has sort of created a policy that has gotten increasingly, I say restrictive only because I think that there was a lot of flexibility I had before that helped students that now I don't have, but I also understand why they're doing it. It's really difficult to say, well, if the grade is the standard measure of a student's success or their learning, can we really let every teacher sort of make up whatever grading scales and systems and, that they want? And so in that situation, do you think it's better for on the policy level, is it good to have the grading policy that keeps everyone on the same page? Or would it be better to let it be a little bit of the Wild West because it might make it easier to go gradeless? Is there a right way to do it?
Oh man. Such a good question. I think I'm rereading, Joe Feldman has a book called Grading for Equity that I'm rereading. And he has a scenario looking at different teachers' grade books and basically talks about if you take the same kid who performed at the same levels and moved them between those teachers, he talked about an experience he had where he was looking at schools and the kid would go from a 65% in one class to a 90% in another class because it was just so wildly different. So thinking about that, I do think there's got to be some sort of policy. My district talks about banks of the river all the time. And I like that. like basically saying, okay, it has to fall within this, like this is the acceptable tolerance of what we'll be willing to look for.
Right.
So I think they can be helpful, but there's also sort of the reality that I've seen a lot where they can backfire at times, like especially when policies push really innovative grading practices and they try to be forced. I mean, that's where I see a lot of it backfire of, I mean, the term standards-based grading at this point means anything and everything, depending on how it's interpreted. But you see so many schools that are like, we're going to do standards-based grading and it has to be this and it has to be this and it has to be this. And as teachers, we're super creative at getting around things we don't want to deal with. And that's where I feel like sometimes it can go awry when the policy comes first.
Yeah.
So I think there can be value in narrowing the scope in a bit, but you nailed it on the head when you talked about if everything is dictated and everybody does the same thing, like there's no room for people to try anything new. There's no room for anyone to discover a better way at that point. Cause
Right.
I can read all the books on grading, but until I've done it in my classroom, I don't really know how to do it.
Yeah. So, I mean, the limiting factor, and that's actually something that bothers me a lot, is that a lot of times when we say enact a new policy, maybe they'll pilot it for a year at one or two schools. And then they're like, all right, we're all doing it, or they just don't. And hey, we're all doing it. And I always feel like, you should phase that in a little bit because, or run two sort of parallel plans and sort of see what works better. Like I'm in a school division where we open a new high school every 2 or 3 years. So there's a lot of growth. So I think we're up to like 17 or 18 high schools in the county. Wow. And so, there's no reason that all 18 of them have to do the same thing, or at least have to start it at exactly the same time. I think, like if we could sort of slowly roll that implementation, we can work out some kinks before it really goes full scale. But yeah, I mean, it gets tricky because you say, okay, we're going to do standards, or, we use the term mastery grading. And they say, okay, so you're not going to grade any of the formatives. You can't grade homework. You put formative assessments in the grade book, but they don't count, which, it logically kind of makes sense. But I think like that's the kind of thing where when you think about how do you make that change, it probably works better if you start in elementary and middle schools and let it work up with the kids. Because when all I teach are juniors and seniors, you tell all of a sudden a kid in junior year going into senior year, hey, we're not going to grade any of the homework at the practice stuff. What that sounds like is I don't have to do any of the homework and the practice stuff, which have at it, do what you need to do. But it gets really tricky. And so like, is there for you teach high school, right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you feel like you get a different reaction from your students individually based on like their age? Like when they come in, do they know that they're maybe going to have a little different grading situation in your class? Like, do you have a reputation for this, or like is it just like they're like, oh gosh, what's going on, school's completely different? Like how does that work sort of age wise? Like are the students ready for that?
Yeah, so I teach mostly freshmen. I've got 3 classes of 9th grade English, and I've had to learn, and I'm still learning, like at this point at the beginning of the year, I run them through scenarios and simulations of like, hey, everybody gets these cards. This is, how you've performed, how things have gone. Like, let's look at this feedback. And I've had to like, because I used to just say, hey, this is how I grade. Here's the procedures, the policies, the overall explanation. They're like, okay, I still don't get it. Like I've grown up. This is year 10 for me in a system that says points are what matter. And now you're telling me like, oh, the points aren't exactly that important. I don't understand any of that. So right. It's really a matter, like I guess I'm the same sort of way. Like I have to run through something and actually experience it before it finally clicks. And so I do that a lot with students. Like we'll do a couple practice things at the beginning, and I'll have them do their whole self-reflection. We'll do a mock like grading conference where we'll sit down and say, here's the feedback you got. Like, let's talk about this. What score would you do? And once they finally start doing that, it starts clicking. But I mean, even so, they've had a whole system where they're a whole 10-ish years, if they're a freshman, where they've been conditioned to believe that, school's a vending machine. Like I put in an assignment and out pops my points and I am happy and move forward. Or the other side, I tried to put in my assignment and I got nothing out, and now I hate vending machines, which are schools.
My assignment is the crinkled dollar bill. Like this is just nothing
keeps
works.
Getting handed back.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough thing to think about the change, and there's so many different ways to think about it, because grades are so important in what we do. uh, they may or may not be important in learning, but they're, I think a lot of this is driven by college. We have concerns about college admissions. And so until colleges sort of change the way they consider, student evaluation and grades, I don't know that you're going to get any massive sort of systemic changes, because college really does drive a lot of it. But we have to think about, like, as the individual teacher, am I doing this right? Do I know what I'm doing? Am I going to be consistent? I have a plan. Do the students understand it? Does it work? Do the parents understand it and buy in? Or did I just buy myself 1,000 extra phone calls and emails? Do I have administrative support? There's so many pieces. But like the most important one is do you know what you're doing? And do the students sort of understand it and buy in? And that's why I asked about like the age thing. I just think about, like, for online school, cameras, like I'm doing online school, elementary school students, middle school students, cameras are on, they're cruising. My junior classes, all right. Seniors, I have to make threats or it has to be a specific part of the assignment. Like, you're giving a speech, we have to see you, otherwise, like, and it's because they've done 2-3 years of it and they've sort of been conditioned to just, we do this with the cameras off. I don't fight with them about it, because my assumption is, as the kids who are a little younger come on up, it's a problem that solves itself. It's a culture issue, and that you have to sort of be acculturated. Like, you have to sort of work your way into it. For you, let's say you do get the student buy-in through demonstrations early in the year. How do your other audiences take it? Like, I mean, like, do other teachers like it? Do they hate you? Like, they're like, this guy's doing this thing, making my job difficult. Like, how do those multiple audiences work for the things you're doing in your classroom?
So you mentioned kind of the colleagues and things like that. It's been rare that I've had someone upset about my grading practices. I get a lot of questions, like, especially this year. One of the things that I know everybody's struggling with is, like, students are getting back into the routine of what we expect them to do in schools has been difficult. And along with that is, like, completing work and turning in evidence of learning. And so, like, a ton of kids, I think, are failing right now because they aren't completing enough work. But the way that I grade, like, my approach is, if I have enough evidence from you to accurately determine your current level of understanding, I can give you that score. There's other stuff that we need to talk about, and there's other non-graded elements that they'll see. But like this year, I have my students are overall being fairly successful. Like, I'm not going to pretend it's perfect. But overall, they're being fairly successful because they're able to give me enough evidence. And I'm starting to get questions from teachers of, like, I'm sick of having a class that's 50% Fs. I don't know what to do. Like, I'm trying everything. And so overall from teachers, it's a fairly positive reception. I mean, there's always the questions of, this isn't how the real world works. Like, there's always that pops up. But I mean, those normally end up in good discussions, because I can tell them, like, yeah, we still, like, are working on timeliness and working on meeting deadlines, and all that's just as important. It just doesn't get demonstrated the same way in the grade book as it does in yours. So from the teacher side, I feel like, rarely do I have someone come up to me upset or like, telling me, like, that's dumb, that doesn't make any sense. I will say the parent side is always the harder one if I'm not good about communicating early, just because, I mean, not because any bad reason, but it's because they're like, wait, this is not how I understand how my student's being successful. Like, I need to go in and check for all the missing assignments, and that's all that I care about. And it's different. And a lot of times sitting down to, like, I have one scenario where a student starts with low scores and then achieves really highly at the end. And then another student that achieves, a middle ground for most of the term. And I can show, like, look, this kid, like, showed the most growth, learned the most, struggled at the beginning, overcame it, achieved highly. This kid, pretty much nothing the whole time. And usually the way that traditional grades work, the student who didn't grow but started at a higher level gets a better grade. And a lot of times, even just that simple scenario is enough for families to be like, oh, yeah, it is kind of screwed up. Okay. Like, just a little buy-in goes a long way at that point of saying, like, well, maybe there is something to this. So, there's definitely hesitation, because novelty is weird and change is weird. And I think sometimes the pitfall when we try to make changes, we don't recognize that, because we've studied grading and assessment and we've looked into it for years and years. and we just assume everyone's on the same page. And so it's been helpful for me to be like, okay, step back. I know nothing about grading and assessment. This is weird. Like this is different. This is not the norm. What do I need to show to help this make sense?
Yeah. You made an interesting point about, the parents, from the parent perspective, I need to be able to log in and check the grade. I need to see the missing assignments. And I remember when we shifted from just having, like when I first started teaching, I'm in my 16th year, I had a paper grade book, but you still had to enter the grades digitally, but it was only like twice a quarter. And it was like the next year, it was, or, maybe it was that year it started, but we had the digital grade book, but there was no online access. And then a few years later, all of a sudden parents have access. And it was like wild for the first couple of years, because you're getting like a million emails. Like, did my kid miss the assignment? They didn't turn in their homework today? And like, okay, like I'm going to limit you to one email a week until we call this down, And so in one way, increasing that sort of transparency in the flow of information is good. On the other side, I think making that grade book visible, where it is just an assignment and a number. And, I put feedback, like we now have this thing where the learning management system has the grade book, but that's not the grade of record. So you have to sync it to the student information system. And so in the learning management system, I put comments everyone can see, but the parents have the app where they check the student information system. They just see the numbers, And so there's like this, giving information is good, but what information are people actually using? And you point out, when people say, well, this is different from what I expect. This isn't what I had when I was in school, or this isn't what most, say, classes or schools do. And then everyone gets tense. Is this going to negatively affect my kid? What does this mean for college admissions or for learning, or how am I supposed to interpret what's going on? Like, how do you handle that if you're trying to reduce the reliance on, say, numeric or letter grades for each individual piece? How do you communicate progress to parents? Like, what do they see when they log into your app or your school's app? What do they see?
So right now they see there's three things and three categories, and two of them are exempted. So one of those exempted categories, and I started this last year. I was not very good about doing this beforehand, but with kids, totally online and not having those sort of spontaneous moments of being able to say, hey, here's where you're at. You forgot to do this last week. I started just recording the major tasks that I needed to be able to get some evidence of where they're at. They're in the grade book as marked as there's a check mark for complete or an exclamation point, meaning it's missing. Because I was really trying to think through, and I think this was really helpful for me, like thinking through each group of, each stakeholder, like what do they need to know? And realistically, in the moment, the parent doesn't need to know if it's a formative that they scored a 1 out of 5, the first time they tried it. What they need to know is, did they try it? Did they engage in something, or is there something they need to be reminded about at home? And so that helps meet that. The other thing that I feel like I get asked every time during parent teacher conferences is like, we'll sit down, and I love the community I get to work in. Like, it's always like, we'll talk about learning. And then the first question is like, I love it. How are they behaving in class? Like it's a great community. And, like, so the other category, I lost my train of thought for a second there. The other category is I have students engage in 2 self-reflections. There's one at the end of each week, and it's either academic progress or academic behavior. And, they go through and kind of evaluate themselves and justify that score. And that also goes in the grade book, because I figured, what else do the parents want to be seeing is, are they, can I help them complete work they might be missing? Are they missing a bunch of stuff? And how are they doing? How are they behaving in class? And the other reason I love it is that's an entry point into a conversation with a student for me. Is, obviously I get to communicate that home to families. Here's how your student's saying they're performing in class. But I mean, there's times where you've got a student that's like, 5 out of 5 this week. And you're like, is it? Are we sure about that?
That's what I was just going to ask you. I'm like, I had a 1 or 2. I don't know if they thought they were being that innovative or not, but I had 1 or 2 teachers in high school that would do like an end of quarter conference, and you could negotiate your grade with them. But, it was always like, do I just say I get, I should have 100, I should have a 99, like, and and I remember one time they're in the corner of the room and the teacher just laughed and literally like laughed the kid away from the desk. Like the kid, I don't even think it was a conversation. The kids went up, said something outlandish, and it's until the kid just got up and walked away. And I'm like, well, it's senior year, I guess we can get away with that. But I know you got to hit your third category. I'm just curious, like, is that a common issue? Like with the self-evaluation, are most of the students honest, or are the kids that you're really most worried about also the ones who are the least honest about it? Like, how does that work out?
I would actually bet the majority of them are too harsh on themselves. That's with freshmen, especially. That's the first conversation I have with them, not necessarily behavior wise, but we do academic conferences too, where we, like they sort of do, they say, what's a grade that you deserve? Let's look at your data. And man, I can't tell you how many times there's a kid that's got like 3 out of 4 for every skill. And they're like 30%, like I deserve an F, like, and I'm like, what? And they're like, yeah, I missed a couple assignments.
You deserve an F in math, but let's focus on English. I got 3 out of 4, then they give me a 30. I don't know. So they're hard on themselves. Is that something that you think they're doing out of caution, or because you maybe intentionally or unintentionally sort of set it up? Or do you think that they're taking it seriously and they're really like being critical of their own work?
I think behavior wise, if they give themselves low scores there, usually the low scores there are pretty accurate. But academic wise, I think a lot of kids are just used to receiving negative messages from grades in schools. Like even the students who are high achievers and are used to getting A's. It was so interesting. I was talking with a friend who his daughter got an A on a test, and he was like, oh, do you feel good about it? She's like, no, I just feel relieved. Like I didn't screw it up. Like they're just so used to grading being a net negative game. Like, and so they see any tiny mistake and they're like, I'm a failure. Like I missed an assignment last week. I deserve an F. I'm terrible. I'm awful. And it's just amazing to me how that's one of the first things I feel like I have to combat is like, listen, you're not the sum of your mistakes. And a lot of kids seem to think that way. And no teacher sends that message intentionally. Like no one would ever tell a kid that on purpose, but I think it's just the way they're used to grading happening in the classroom. They're just used to waiting until they screw up and then there goes their grade. And so those first few, there's always the kids that want to like dip their toes and like test the water and be like 105%. Let's see how this goes. And you're like, okay, no, we got to talk about this. But a lot of them are like, well, based on what I'm used to with grades, I deserve to be, I deserve an F or a D or whatever it is. And, so that's the more common one I find, which is really interesting. And actually this year I've been playing with looking at the breakdown of demographics of my students who are doing that. And the big split that I see, at least in our community, are my male identifying students are usually the overconfident ones. And sadly, my female identifying students undervalue or devalue their performance and give themselves lower scores. So
interesting.
It's open doors for some other interesting things for me to think about in terms of our education system and how it impacts people.
That is interesting. And just because, I mean, how long have you been teaching?
This is year 9 actually for me.
Okay. So, I mean, so you have enough frame of reference, but like, I feel like over the last, I don't know, 5 years, 8 years, something like that, I've seen a noticeable trend where as the average grade in the class, whatever that may be, more of the above average grades are girls and the below average grades are guys. And that was not necessarily the case when I first started teaching. And I've tried to be very careful about it to make sure it's like, I'm not letting some sort of like subconscious bias of my own creep in that's causing it. And for the beginning of the year, I just grade essays. I don't know you. I don't, whatever. And once we get usually around a quarter into the year and I've read the writing a little bit, we don't do names anymore. We do student ID numbers. Mm-hmm. And then that way, like I try to like grade it blind. So it doesn't matter if I think you're, the smartest kid, the dumbest kid, the nicest kid, the meanest kid. It doesn't matter. I'm just grading the paper in front of me. It has nothing to do with you. It's just the work. And so I try to do things like that to keep myself honest. And I've seen these sort of weird shifts where like the girls are like creeping ahead in ways, and I don't really know how to explain it at all. But I think we're also seeing that in terms of like More girls are going to college than young men. More young men who go to college are dropping out than the young women. Like there's this like very interesting kind of cultural shift. And so it's interesting that you say that in the grading piece, that the girls are harder on themselves, because on one hand that's discouraging, but on the other hand, when you're hard on yourself but then work to improve, that actually can lead to improvement. That, you know, how you said like kids feel like, oh, there goes my grade. Yeah, I mean, I don't do it as much in the last couple of years. The pandemic sort of gotten into stuff, but I used to, every quarter I would start them with something really hard so that everybody starts with a low grade, so you have nowhere to go but up. Like I would very intentionally like, hey, look, we got to do this. And there, you know, I don't want you to be sad, oh, I had 100 and then it fell. No, you all started with something in the 50s or the low 60s, and I make it look big. And then as the quarter goes on, the grades get more valuable. So in the end, that first one doesn't really count, or sometimes I just scrap it, you know, and you play with it. But by having that sort of high expectation and starting with something critical, sometimes it leads to growth. Do you think that it can have that effect? Like when students are self-evaluating or when you're conferencing, how important is it for them to be critical of themselves? Like, are those girls benefiting from it, or is that a negative sort of thing for their mental health or their well-being?
I think it stems from a negative place, but it usually results in something positive, just because it ends up being a moment where I get to allow them to like reflect and identify their strengths. Is one of the things that, you know, I love about that is I get to show up and say like, hey, explain to me why you were so hard. Like, you know, like, why is this the grade you gave themselves? And then, you know, they'll explain it and I'll say, well, what about this? Can you look at this, you know, this feedback that you got? What about this? And they're like, oh yeah, I guess I was doing pretty well. Like this is something that I'm growing in, I'm getting better in. And so it is, I feel like it ends up in a positive place. And kind of like you said, like the students that overscore themselves or you know, come in with way too much confidence, they're not critical about their learning. Like I think it's I know there's a term for it, but basically the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And I think a lot of the students that are too hard on themselves, that's what's going on, is they've started to understand what's going on and learn the content. And now they're finding all these different things that they don't fully understand, versus someone who, you know, entry level idea of what this thing is, they feel like they got that and they're like, oh yeah, I got the whole thing 100%. Like I learned everything. So, you know, I do think it's not necessarily a huge red flag for me if a student comes in giving themselves a lower score. You know, I think you hit it on the head pretty well. Like a lot of times it is someone who is thinking deeply about their performance and what they're learning, and they're identifying areas they still have to grow, and they think that's a bad thing, so they score themselves lower, but it results in a good conversation.
Yeah. It's like, you got to be careful not to internalize it. Like, I mean, in my AP, you know, I teach AP Lang, AP Lit. And I do a lot, like once they're far enough into the year where I think they understand the rubric and the expectations, because I can't keep, I mean, it's just so much grading, you know, if you want them to write enough, you can't really grade at all. But if they're doing all the writing and they're not getting any feedback on it, then it's, in theory, it's okay practice, but without the feedback, you could just be practicing all the wrong things. And so once we hit a point where I'm like, okay, I think, you know, most kids get it well enough. We do a lot of peer grading where student ID numbers go and everything. No one sees a name. You grade your peers, you do whatever, you get your paper back with, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 peer scores with little explanations, whatever. And then you pick your own score. But I always tell them that, like, the grade you get is the grade you get, and I'm going to read it and whatever, but I'm going to read it. And before I pick my number, I'm going to look at what you put, you know, but, you know, like I already know where I think we're going, but I'll always sort of give you the benefit of the doubt. But I tell them that, you know, sometimes we'll do like a second sort of small grade, which now in the new policy, like can't really count. So sometimes I try to like fold it in as like an extra credit, or, you know, I find a way to like make it count somehow. But I tell them, you know, if you get your score exactly right, you know, there's like a bonus in it. Like if you were honest in the quality of your work, you understood the rubric, you know. And I say, but if you're going to be wrong, you can be wrong 1 point low. Don't go high. Like you give yourself the right score. And if you're going to be wrong, you go 1 low. If you go high, you weren't critical enough. If you go more than 1 low, you were too critical and you weren't being honest about the quality of work. And they freak out. Like kids come up and they're like, I don't know what number to pick. I don't know whatever. And like, you know, I don't tell them unless they really, like, I can see the kids really in distress. And I'm like, this isn't real. Like, it's all made up. I'm trying to keep you honest and get you to be critical of your own work. But, you know, I always tell them you learn more when you are sort of hard on yourself in those ways, you just can't internalize it to a point where it hurts your confidence. Thinking about, well, the way you're doing the feedback and the self-assessment. And by the way, and part of this, I know I cut you off before you got to the third category. I'm assuming that's some sort of summative or whatever. So you can clarify that. But like, as they're doing sort of the completion, the check, whatever, for some of this formative and practice stuff, they're doing their own reflections and self-evaluations. And then there's this third piece, which you can clarify, but how do those pieces affect the student motivation? Like, do students work harder, less hard? Is motivation not really a concern? Like, motivation is a big deal when it comes to grading, or vice versa. How does that play out in your class? And if the third category is important, that certainly speak to it.
Yeah. So the third category is, like, you got it. It's the skill that we're working on, and their final score, I use the term their summative evaluation, not necessarily their final test, but we look at their performance over time, the feedback, their scores, and then we evaluate based on that data. Where are you at, currently? And, I do think that connects a lot to motivation. And I know, like, a lot of the talk around motivation that I hear is usually framed around using lower scores or punitive point measures to motivate students to engage in work. And like, one of the pieces that I've really been paying attention to and looking into is, especially if the way we're calculating grades, if that final grade includes the earlier scores, one of the things that, like, we know the strive or the drive for mastery, like Daniel Pink's book Drive about intrinsic motivation talks about mastery as the ability to be successful. We lose so many kids so early on because they get low scores that are going to be factored into their final grade, and they're doing that math in their head. They're like, well, there goes my chance at a decent grade. I might as well just shoot for the minimum. Like, the potential for success is taken away pretty early a lot of times for students. And, that's one of the other things I do to set my students up at the beginning of the year is I a lot of times we'll do new content that they haven't been exposed to before, and I'll give them a quick, like, formative check, see how they do. And students might get a lower score on it. And I like being able to say, like, that's not impacting your grade. Like, eventually over time, if that score doesn't improve, if you don't learn, that might impact your grade later on. But right now we're learning. Like, learning is not a fast game. It's something that takes time and it takes effort. And I have found, especially this year with my freshmen, more motivation in allowing them to, like, giving them scores that aren't even calculated into the grade book and allowing them to see growth. Like, if I can show them, hey, look, you engaged in 5 tasks focused on this skill, and look at this, like, you started at a 2, you moved up to a 3, like, here was the feedback you got. I've seen a lot more students like, oh, that's why I do practice. Okay, I get it. Like, it's like I'm growing. I can see that growth, as opposed to when it was just like, check the box, yay, I got it done. So, and that's been a big, the last few years, most of my grading and assessment work has really been centered around motivation with students, because, like, I think, and not specifically motivation, more specifically confidence with students. I think there are so many students who, even with rubrics, like, I think about how I word rubrics often. It's like a level 4 in 5 or whatever the scale would be is like, celebrate. And then 1, 2, and 3 is like, let me point out everything you're bad at. When really at a level 1, 2, or 3, whatever our scale we're going to use, that student learned something, that student, like, did accomplish something, but so often we're not naming it. We're not helping them engage in, it's called the competence confidence loop. But the idea of, when we see something we're competent in, we're more willing to engage, to have the confidence to try that next step that we might be uncomfortable with, because we know, like, oh, I'm competent here. Like, I have a foundation. So I totally got sidetracked. I forgot the question.
Yeah, no. Well, no, it's partially my fault. I get on a roll and then I ask 3 questions at once and let people sort it out for themselves. But no, I mean, like, with the motivation, like, okay, so I'll use an example. And I think this is maybe something I think it was you tweeted this out not too long ago, and if you didn't, then I apologize, but I think it was you. Somebody put up, or you put up, I had a student who scored a 3 out of 16 on something, which would have looked like a failure, except they had gotten like a 1 out of 16 the first time. So because it was essentially the idea was, because it's not affecting their grade, we got to celebrate growth. But if it was going into the grade book, they both look like a failure, right? And so like how like that sounds great, right? You say that, like, that makes sense. Like, I don't even know. I don't even the most strict grade oriented parent would still like see the logic in this. Like, okay, the kid did better, and that's great. But is that a legitimate either way to motivate the student or to help the student build confidence? Or like, I mean, at some point, even if we're ungrading it, like at some point, is it still okay to just be like, look, this sucks and you need to do better at it? Like, like, for that tweet, say for that student thinking about that motivation or the carryover to confidence, how does that play out instead of just in one unit? How does that in your mind play out over a year? Like the effect on that student?
I think a lot of it is where are we identifying that they're starting at? Like, are we starting from like an asset-based approach of this is what you're learning and this is how you're growing? And then, there's still a lot we got to, there's still a long way that we got to go, but it's not necessarily starting with, there's a long way you got to go. It's starting with, and hopefully linking that effort and outcome together for the student to say like, hey, you started at this level, like you knew this thing, and then we studied, we practiced, and because you did that, you're getting better. So we still have a long ways to go, but do you see how like your engagement, your actions led to that growth? That's been one of the things that, as I've been like reading more and more, has been kind of mind blowing to me, is so many students don't see the inherent connection between their actions and the outcome in terms of grades, because so often they're used to grades just being something that's done to them. Like they're not involved in any sort of conversation, discussion. It's just, you did this thing and here's a score. And then next time you do another thing and here's another score, but it's not necessarily them able to see, okay, I struggled. I tried some more, tried again. It got better. My effort, my engagement, my practice was the difference between those two. And so that they can really see how their effort is leading to growth, or how their actions, their output is leading to that increase in scores. And
I mean, in that way, that's empowering though, right? Like it's when they see that they are directly influencing not only their own learning, but say the grade, they're going to go on the report card, whether they care about the grade or the learning or both, being able to make that connection for themselves rather than someone else sort of, like you said, handing it to them, forcing that on them. I mean, it's gotta feel different. I mean, even if in the end you get the same grade out of it, you probably feel very differently about it. Right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's been one of the things that's been interesting to me as I've like done more with grading and tried different things in the classroom, is even some of my students who end up with D's or C's at the end of a course. Like I not last year, because last year was last year, but a few years back, I had a student who ended up with a D. And, we had our final grade conference and we sat down and they said, I deserve, this percent, whatever, here's how I performed, blah, blah, blah. And I was just like, well, how do you, like, you okay with that? And they were like, yeah, I would have gotten an F if I had stopped. Like I was really struggling, but like, this is not a great subject for me. I still struggle with it, but like, I got better, and I definitely don't know everything and I don't feel super confident, but I feel like I learned and I grew. And like, that was something that was really eye-opening for me, is when a grade is a process they engage in, or something that they have a say in and control over. It's not like someone else is slapping them with the label, which I think is oftentimes the most harmful thing we do with grades. Is it's like this extrinsic force, the teacher just, here's your label, this is what you are. It's, if a student has a say in that process, and even if they say, I'm struggling, I deserve that same score, but I'm a part of this process. Like I understand that I have a role to play in this. I'm just not I'm not just getting tossed around by somebody giving me grades. I'm like actually engaged in this.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many sort of interesting dynamics with grading itself, because it's supposed to be feedback on the quality of your work and your learning, but so often behavior gets wrapped up in it. And I mean, it's awful to say, but I think we all know it's real. Like, you get favoritism or the opposite of, and so the teacher's sort of personal opinions and biases can factor in heavily, particularly in the humanities. I mean, like in English class, and I can grade an essay. You hand me whatever rubric you want. Like, I will lawyer that rubric and make it say whatever I want if I'm motivated to do so, which is why I try to keep my rubrics fairly like, here are broad categories and you get numbers. And then I write individualized comments with them, because the comment says what you're doing well and what you need to do better. If I try to load all that language into the rubric, we get something that you're never going to read. It's too complicated to look at. And then I find myself trying to game my own rubric to give a certain number. Just keep it simple. Here are the numbers, and here's the feedback that really matters. Here are the individualized written comments. And it's a little slow, but I think it works better and it's more honest. But I mean, students internalize this, right? If I had $1 for every time a kid said, "But I'm an A student," and I'm like, "Okay, so," and they're like, "But I got a C+ on the paper," and I'm like, "All right, so," and they're like, "But I'm an A student." I'm like, let's do a quick lesson in circular reasoning here. Because what you're saying is you're an A student because you get A's, so you should get an A so you can continue being an A student. They're like, right? And I'm like, but that's not an A paper. And they're like, and I'm like, so it would be better if you didn't label yourself as an A student, because if you want to keep doing it, you now have to say you're a C student, and it doesn't have the same ring to it. They're like, what? I'm like, all I'm saying is we got to do better, and you shouldn't count this as like a criticism of you or internalize it. It just means that on this particular paper, we need to do a little bit better, but that becomes a thing. I'm an A student, I'm a B student. We think of it this way, and that's certainly not the intent of a grading policy, but it's probably something we need to be mindful of, right? I always say, like, the most damaging thing you can do is to unnecessarily reprimand or discipline a kid in elementary school. If you get suspended in elementary school, in your head, I'm a kid who gets suspended. You're like, you just created a lifetime of behavior issues because the kid internalizes the label. Like, those kind of things should be like the last resort, because yes, we have to react to whatever just happened. But if we come down too hard or we apply a label unfairly, that gets internalized. And I think we do that instead of, say, the one big, like, boom, you're suspended. We do it, instead of dropping the boulder on you, you're suspended. We just like pellet you with pebbles, and everyone is the grade. It's a C, it's a D, it's a B, and as those pebbles hit, like, eventually you just sort of internalize it. I don't know that that's a healthy way to think about your learning or about, or yourself. I mean, really, is it likely, like, if say more people move to something less grade focused or gradeless, or, whatever that is, do you think that as a general public, like, would people feel differently about school? Like, would parents feel differently about their kids' education if their own experience with grades had been different? Like, is this a culture issue?
Very much so. Yeah. And like, it stood out to me really clearly this year where, so for the majority of the unit, it was student self-evaluation, student reflections, things like that. And at the very end of the unit is where, we did the final evaluation of the skills that we'd been working on, and they went in the grade book. And that was the first time that a real grade had, a real grade based on the skills had really shown up for students. And I mean, it was night and day in terms of some of the behavior that I saw in my classroom, because I think what happened is, for however long, some students had a little bit of a respite from what they had associated themselves to be based on previous scores. Like, oh, I'm an F kid, or I'm a C kid, or whatever. And they had a long period of time where they didn't have that label, and they weren't getting that, like, the pebbles. They weren't constantly being reminded, this is who you are. Because, I mean, we have to recognize we're dealing with kids who are shaping their identity and looking for any external factor to help them understand who they are. And we're saying, oh, here's a factor. It's a grade. Yeah.
Here's a C-. Yeah. Have some identity.
And so I think you're right. It's so internalized for so many students. And the instant they see that show up, a lot of students, it's just, yep, that reaffirms what I already thought about myself. And I'm going to conform to that role. Or, I mean, this is why I think we see so much disengagement, or like, I just call it learned or forced helplessness with students, where they get an F and they're like, well, that's what I've gotten my whole career. And I just keep getting them over and over. So why would I even try? Like, I just keep getting this thrown at me. And this year was, the first time I really had noticed and intentionally paid attention to that moment where the grades felt more official for students. And it was like, for some students, it was just night and day in terms of how they viewed their role in school.
Yeah. And I mean, you think about all the ways that like letter grades have factored in to the language, it's how we like, you go on like a used car website and they're giving like the car a letter grade. Like that doesn't make any sense, like, and there's so many things that we think of in grading terms, which is really kind of strange because I don't know, more about grading than I do, but I mean, as far as I can tell, the grading system we see or something like it didn't really exist until American universities. It's somewhere in the second half of the 1800s. Like I've heard it's Harvard, I've heard it's Princeton. Somebody said it was like Penn State or I don't know, but I'll go with Harvard because it seemed like the most official thing I've read. But like this letter grade system didn't even exist until like the 1880s, 1870s, right? And so the fact that it's like it's one of the dominant features of our education system, and it's sort of crept out into the way we assess so many other things. It's insane, like I forget the book. I think it was in like Sapiens or something. The guy writes that like, Isaac Newton, didn't graduate with like a 4.0 GPA because there was no such thing. How did you know when to graduate? When you took enough classes and all the professors met, they're like, yeah, he's got it. And they're like, okay, you got it. How do you pick a valedictorian? The faculty literally got together and dropped names. They're like, who was the best student? Who learned the most? All right, you're the valedictorian. And that's how it was done for hundreds of years. And so, I mean, granted, 140 years or whatever it is an ample amount of time. But for it to become one of the defining features of such an important institution is really kind of bizarre, particularly when so many people get bad grades. Like if everybody got good grades, like, okay, of course we want to use this language everywhere. Like, when so many people struggle with it, the fact that we've adopted it and sort of live by it just strikes me as strange. In terms of sort of history, I'm going to ask you a two-part question. And it's a terrible question. I want to make sure I ask you both of them. And if you lose your train of thought, I will try to remind you. But what, like that sort of historical development, like how important or unimportant is that now? Because as places are redefining, oh, we're now doing standards-based or mastery grading or, whatever. If we're changing the way we think about it, the way we approach it, how important is the history? Do we need to know that stuff? And then this is the part that you may forget or whatever, but I also want to know, like, not your GPA, but how did grades work out in your own schooling? We're thinking historically, because if you have oh, well, I was a D student, but so of course this guy wants to, get rid of the grading. But I mean, before we do the personal one though, is the history of grading, is that an important thing to consider? Or is it just, it's nice for historians, but it doesn't matter for a practicing teacher?
I think you have to consider it if you're asking people to change it, because if you look back, it's been around. I think you're right. Like latter half of the 1800s is when it first started showing up. But if you look at the scales that were used and how it was used, like so many people point back to like, yeah, but we've had grades for so long. But if you look at the scales and how it's used, it changed all the time. I mean, you went from like, I think there was one of the first ones, it was like one of the first times letter grades showed up, it was like A, B, C, D, F. Like the first time that showed up, I think in like an F was like a 78 or above or something like that. And so like people are like, yeah, but we've used these letters for so long. And like, but we haven't. They're arbitrary things we've just thrown around, and it's changed all the time. And, for me, knowing the history is nice because it allows me to recognize like this is a fluid thing that is constantly changing. And it's not like we're asking to change something that's never changed. It's not a stagnant thing. It's constantly evolving and moving. And let's just think about where's it going next. And so that's it. But, you mentioned like my personal story, and this will kind of connect to it. Like I think the reason we see so little change in grades, and you earlier you connected to sort of the cultural piece of grades and grading, is if you think about most people who end up in positions of power, take that word as we will, were served well by our grading system. They had a decent enough grade to go to a decent enough school, to get a decent enough job, to feel like they have the right to say how school should operate. Like that's sort of how it works. And so I think that's one of the hardest things when we talk about changing the grading system, is you have to recognize the pushback to this are going to be people that don't understand there is a problem. Yeah. And so I feel like I got lucky. I ended with, my poor parents, I still remember, I was always the kid that had the 88%. And they were like, why did you not get A's? And I was like, I didn't care. I had other things that were more important. I knew I was supposed to get this arbitrary letter and that somehow was supposed to make my future better. So I was like, whatever, I'll do what I need to do. And so, I just going through that experience, I didn't see a problem with grades because they were never a problem for me. It was just, I'll do what I need to do. I'll play the game and get the points and, find the easiest route. And it worked. But I started the time it really opened my eyes. I had a student, my second year of teaching, who to this day is probably one of the most fantastic writers I've ever had in my class. Like just the way that she could capture ideas and how she phrased things. I very rarely meet someone that I'm like, you were just inherently a writer. Like there is just something in the way you see the world that is poetic. And, she was this student and she was constantly reading, and she ended up with a single digit grade in my class, just a 9% or something at the end of the term. And I remember just sitting down with her and being like, what is going on? She's like, oh, I've just never been good at English. And that was just all the red flags went flying. And I was like, something has to change. If a kid who the class that I am, the skills I want my kids to know, she's twice as good as I am in them. And she's failing a class and thinks she's bad at English. That was the cue for me of this isn't a game that we play. I played it as a game in high school because I could. But this isn't a game we play. We have brilliant writers leaving my classroom with an F, failing, thinking they're bad at English. And so that to me was when you start listening to the stories of kids, and this is one of the things that I do a lot. And usually when I go to a school to start talking about grading, one of the first things I do is either bring the survey that I give to a lot of students already or ask them to do it with theirs, and just ask, it's 3 questions. Do grades help you learn? How do grades make you feel? And why do teachers use grades? That as a starting point, when you listen to what kids say about grades, I've never been able to give that survey. Granted, I'm a little biased, but I've never been able to give that survey and walk away from reading those responses and go, yeah, we're good. Nothing needs to change. Yeah. Even the kids that the highest performing students that the 4.0, valedictorian is sitting there do grades help you learn? And they're usually the ones that are no, they stress me out. I don't learn anything. All I care about is the points. Then you go all the way to the students that are constantly failing classes. Do grades help you learn? No. They just make me feel dumb. I don't want to do anything. And you're like, who is this serving except for the adults that need an efficient system to categorize students as they leave school? I really don't know.
Oh man, oh geez, I just blanked on the name of the book. Michael Sandel is a Harvard philosophy professor, and it was about a year ago, he released the book, The Tyranny of Merit. That's what it is. The Tyranny of Merit. Strongly recommend if you haven't checked it out. But the whole thing, he talks about how, and he works at Harvard, and he basically half the book is criticizing Harvard for its influence in the way college admissions works. And as a result, the way high school grading works. And it's remarkable to the point where I was like, okay, guys, we got to do something with this. So my AP classes last year, I copied one chapter. It's a 50-page chapter, but I was like, one chapter, you got 2 weeks, read it, you need to do all this. And then we just sort of talked about it. And they're like, what's the assignment? I was like, I need to know what you think about it. You're going to write something, but first, don't worry about it. Let's just deal with this idea. And they really got into this whole thing that, grades become a way, it is a game, and it's especially for the kids who do well at it, I don't want to say the brightest kids, because I have a lot of very bright kids who don't get good grades, but for the kids who are either, sort of academically inclined or who have the motivation from home that like you need to get that grade up. I was the same like as you. I was my school didn't do a 4-point scale. I think I finished with like an A- GPA, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I did an A- GPA, and I really didn't do that much. I got a lot of B pluses, I got a lot of A-. It was enough that I felt like I learned some stuff, and it kept my parents off my back. Like if they had pushed harder, I would have had better grades because that's what I would have had to do. But the whole thing, it turns into this like this game, and it's this way that we like assign merit. It's not that this person purely earns it. It's that we're assigning merit based on, in some ways, arbitrary scales or arbitrary content. I mean, why do we teach this class and not this class? Or why does the teacher make this assignment worth 100 and this one worth 75? And, sometimes there's a really good reason. And sometimes you're like, oh, that's just what I always do, and there's so many parts of this where it has such a big impact, not only in someone's self-image, but also on, their future prospects, if they're planning on continuing school and education. And it's just messed up. Like it's just, it's not necessarily the best way to do it. And I say this as someone who I still assign grades. I still use the grading scale, but I'm trying very hard to, I don't know, find a way to like move away from it, or it's still there, but like I'm trying to do more drafting and writing so that by the time I do grade it, it'd be pretty hard to score low because I've already given you all this feedback. But I think sometimes like, it's like you're swimming against the stream a little bit, because the system, it's so entrenched in everything we do that it's really hard to make a meaningful change. As we think about that, like, the goal is for students to be learning, to be setting people up, or, to do whatever it is they're going to do. If grading is an important part of school, then I always feel like, we should align things philosophically. Like if we should know our goal and then align things to it. To you, sort of put grading on the side for a second. Just think school in general, like as say a public school system or, whatever. What is the purpose? Like, what are we trying to accomplish by working with young people every day the way we do?
I mean, I would sum it up. My goal when students leave, like to me, a successful high school graduate is confident in their ability to learn anything, like, and I mean that in terms of the academic skills, right? They need to have a level of background knowledge and understanding about these key areas and the way the world works to be able to actually use that then to learn in the future, right? Like there's just certain background things they have to know. But I also mean that in terms of those, I hate the term soft skills, but those skills that we want them to be able to engage in, of being able to problem solve and, like be able to honestly just get some things done. Like there's a reality, you just have to be able to get things done. So when I say like confidence in the ability to learn anything, it's that, I'm confident I've developed the skills that I need to be successful. And to me, that's why grades can sometimes distract from it so much. Cause like you said, I feel like you said it perfectly. Like some of our brightest students are the ones with low grades, and they're leaving not confident in their ability to learn. They're leaving like, well, I sucked. I guess that's just my outcome in life. Like they're not confident that they're going to be.
Yeah. Well, you got like the girl who's a great writer. By the way, when you're talking about that, I'm not going to name the name, but I was student teaching, and I did like 6 weeks in high school, 6 weeks in middle school. And then, then I graduated or whatever. And there was a girl who her writing, like she turned in everything late and, whatever, but she was really nice. And my supervising teacher was like this old school 8th grade English teacher. She was probably in her 60s, but I was 22 and I thought she was 90. And like, she was very like, stiff upper lip or whatever. And when I got to writing, I was like, have you read her writing? And she's like, yeah. And I was like, what do we do? She turned in 2 weeks late. Your policy is blah, blah, blah. And she's like, I know. And she goes, and I was like, so what do you want me to do? And she goes, what do you think we should do? And I was like, well, by your policy, I got to give her a D, but like, I want to publish it. So what? And she goes, yeah, I would give her an A and then make a note about how we need to hit timelines and drop it to the highest A-. And I was like, but your policy. And she goes, I know. And I was like, and I said, why? And she goes, she needs to know she's good at it. And if we put an F on it or a D on it, she won't know it. And I was like, oh, like this, like very strict old school woman. She's like, And that was one of those moments where it's like, okay, like I still to this day, I photocopied her entire writing journal. I keep it on a bookshelf. It's like next to Hemingway and Fitzgerald is this eighth grader's journal, but so that confidence piece is really important. And you said soft skills. You said you don't like the term, by the way. I don't know. Do you know Joe Pizzo? He's all over Twitter. He's a middle school English teacher in northern New Jersey. And I forget what episode number I talked to him on, but it was great conversation. He's in his like 44th year teaching or something. It's amazing.
Nice.
And he and a friend of his, they've coined the term power skills because they said, I hate soft skills because it makes it sound like it's flimsy. It sounds unimportant, whatever. And they said, really think about what these skills do. They give you the power to get things done and to interact with people. So now anytime someone mentions soft skills, I make a point to credit Joe and be like, power skills. Because, you're like, I hate the term, but it is important. How much of what we're actually doing in school aligns with those goals though? Like if the goal is for the kids to learn enough to be able to learn more and to make their own decisions in life and to be confident in their abilities, and to be, I'm going to say this for you, and if I'm wrong, correct me, but not to be overconfident. Like if you're good at a thing, you need to know it. If you have the ability to get good, you need to know it and then get good at it. And on the other hand, there's some things that maybe you're not great at, and it's okay for you to know that too, right? Like I don't think any of us are necessarily promoting a false confidence, but a reasonable confidence in your abilities and your capacities. Is what we're doing in school actually aligned to that? Like, are we making good decisions to achieve that goal?
I think so. I think it's happening more and more. And what we'll see, what's going to happen is what always happens. Everybody tries to move a little bit more that way and then panics because chaos breaks out for a second and then we swing back, but we usually don't go all the way back. So I do feel like we're moving in the right direction. But, I would say the majority of what we're teaching kids still is be compliant, like do the things that we are asking you to do, which is there an element of, I want my students to be cognizant of that when they leave? Yeah, but it's not the 90% of what we're focused on in schools. It's a much smaller percent that I think is still somewhat important. But, even simple things like, how are we asking kids to learn? Like a good friend of mine, Patrick Green, has this great video, and it's like a parody of all those like teaching practice fancy videos. Here's what you need to do. And it's the shoulder shrug. And he just like, it's this hilarious video of all these teachers practicing just like shrugging when someone asks them a question. And I think there's a reality that we need to do that more sometimes in the classroom. Like we know when kids are super close, and if we're always the one stepping in, all we're teaching them is you can't do this yourself, right? If we're always stepping in, even when they're right there and we know they could do it on their own, we're telling them like, oh, no, don't figure that on your own. Like just be the person that sends an email asking for a YouTube video, like,
can I get a little help here?
Yeah. And so, I think we're close. Like I see so much good movement in that direction, but it's going to be a battle of like any change in school. It's going to happen. It's not going to go well the first time, and we're going to retreat a few steps, and then we're going to just sort of slowly make our way forward that way.
Yeah. I think, I think I actually just mentioned this in an episode I released probably this week or something, but there's an article. I don't even know when it came out, maybe 20 years ago, maybe more. I'm not sure. And it's the title that sticks with me. Like I read most of the paper and it's good, but it's someone writing a criticism of like, American educational, work. And it's like the fetishizing of pedagogy, and it's that people get like so wrapped up. This is the way to do it, that it becomes the only way to do it in their mind, and I think that that's what happens sometimes is people get in charge. Like, you did a nice job of avoiding this in like one of the first things you said. You're like, I'd like to get rid of the grade, but it's not the worst thing if we still have some grades or there's a grade at the end. It's not that we have to obliterate all grades. It's that maybe that shouldn't be the only thing we're doing, and, where I'm at, where I'm working, it might be fading a little bit right now, but for a few years, there's this huge push, all project-based learning. Every teacher in the county took like 4 days off school to go to this development. Think about how much money they spent on subs, plus the trainers, plus all that stuff, because all of it's going to be project-based learning. And I was like, yeah, I mean, it's good, but once in a while I could just hit them with a 30-minute lecture, and I could give them 2 weeks of a project or 30 minutes of me talking, like, can we do both? And they're like, well, we'd really like you to stop with the direct instruction. And I'm like, entirely? Like, let's be reasonable. Like, these all exist because they work sometimes, and so, as we think about, say, building up some of those power skills, or the confidence to learn, the ability to learn, or all the adaptations we're making because of students' access to technology. Like, I was thinking we've got to be very, not that the change itself has to be slow, though it usually will be, but like there's a degree of like moderation. We don't all need to jump into the deep end at the same time holding hands. Like, there's other parts of the pool, and we can all sort of figure this out a little bit. And grading's probably a good place to have that discussion, because I think there are people who are very intent on keeping it as is because they're used to it. It's predictable. There are people who are very radically just, all grades are gone. And, by the way, I don't know. You ever see the show Fresh Off the Boat? I haven't seen it. It's like sitcom. It's pretty funny. I know it's been around for years. I haven't. I don't watch a lot of TV, but I don't know how old the episode is, but they move. It's this Asian American family, and they move to like Florida, and the kids go to a brand new school, and the Chinese mother is like, I don't understand your grades. Like, she's making the kid do like the after school extra math work. And she's looking at, and it's like a strawberry, a blueberry, and whatever. Like, and she's like, what is this? And the kid's like explaining what each piece of fruit is. And she's like, is that an A? And she's like getting so angry that the school won't just give them the grade, And I think about that. I almost thought about leading this conversation with that. And then I was like, I don't know enough about the show to properly contextualize it, but we don't need to go to like blueberry and strawberry. Like, we don't need a fruit scale, but maybe modifications to this would help to achieve those purposes that you just outlined. Do you think that that's possible? Like, do the people who have the influence also have the self-control to not necessarily go 100 miles an hour right away on something new?
I think so. And I think you hit it really well with the project-based learning. One of the things that we are so guilty of in education is confusing means with goals, right? Like, even for me, standards-based grading is never a goal. Like, that is not the goal of grading reform. The goal of grading reform is more equitable assessment practices that build confidence in students. Like project-based learning is great, but it's not a goal, right? The goal is students have more ownership over their learning, and they're developing those skills we talked about. Some of the best schools that I see are really good at clarifying what the actual goal is, as opposed to just adopting this new initiative. Like I see this a lot. Like, Avid's got some really great stuff about it, but one of the things I see as a shortcoming for a lot of schools that adopt Avid is they're like, this is the goal, right? Like, Avid is the goal. And you're like,
we're going to do this.
Yeah.
But why?
Like, we are an Avid school. You're like, cool. Like, I don't know. It's a means, right? Like, it's a means to build skills for students so that they reach this other goal. The best schools are really good at saying, this is the goal. And kind of like what you said about not just jumping all the way in, but also saying, here's where we're starting. Like, that's one of the things that I've had to really, in some of my assessment work, I built this learning progression for assessment. Like, if you want to get to student conferencing with grades, awesome. What's the starting point? Like, what's that first step of, just, are your assessments aligned to standards? Like, let's start there. Everybody can do that. That's an easy thing to dip your toes. But I think so often in education, it's like the whole school's getting on board, toss everyone in the pool. And you're like, everyone wasn't ready to swim. Like, that person's still wearing their jeans. Like, they were clearly not ready for this. So that's what, I agree. Like, the means become so distracting. We want to just be the thing, a standards-based grading school, an Avid school, a project-based learning school, when really we got to step back and be like, okay, those are means. The goal is, what do we want with kids? Like, what are kids developing? Where are they going with this? And a lot of times when you do that, it's a lot easier not to jump fully in, because you start to realize, like, oh, it's not just doing the thing. It's really thinking about how are we building a practice.
Yeah. This is something I learned. I did like a teacher externship program many years ago. And I was actually at AOL at America Online, which used to be headquartered in Loudon, where I work. And there was a guy there, and I forget what we were talking about. We were learning something about what they do and how to apply some of this in the classroom. And he mentioned this very simple idea called the 5 whys, which is apparently very important. Like if you're a consultant, and he goes, so, if I come in and I'm going to try to improve your efficiency, I say, okay, so what are we doing here? Why? And I listen to it, and and I figure out what's the most important part of what you just said. And then I say, why to that? And he goes, it's the general belief that you can't get to a root cause or to a really, truly desirable outcome until you've answered the question, why, 5 or more times, and it's not that it's like there's a magic number, but the whole point is that when you say, well, okay, we're an average school, why? Oh, well, we want to increase, first generation college enrollment, or, whatever that goal may be. Okay, why? Well, and by the second or third one, and by the way, I've learned to keep my mouth shut in faculty meetings on this, because no one wants to actually sit through the meeting long enough to do it, but we all might benefit if, it's like, but why? And it's not about being annoying or being different. It's saying that if we really want to do it right, we need to know those big answers. And so you hit on like a good sort of purpose for school. The other big question that I ask all guests is about like if you had your own school. And so I'm not going to make you do the 5 whys on your school, but imagine for a moment that you had total freedom. Like the only requirements are students need to be learning and they can't die. Like, but imagine like essentially like a private school situation where you have whatever kind of building you want or don't want, you have a staff, students, whatever, like get as weird with it or not as whatever as you feel like, but what to you would be sort of the ideal school? Like what program would you put forth for students?
Oh, I love that. So I'm going to say, first of all, I'm not going to use any existing grading program. Like that's just because I feel like that dictates so much what we do. So those are out the window. Someone is going to make a really cool one that just allows students to track competencies across all content areas, which is already starting with certain grading programs. I'm loving to see that come up, but the foundation of kind of my dream school comes from, I believe it's called the Apollo School. Like I saw a TED Talk once. That's the extent of what I know about the Apollo School. So I'm not an expert, but the idea behind it is each student has an advisor, and that's like the person they meet with regularly. For their content area classes, they have interdisciplinary projects that integrate multiple content area classes. So they're working on one thing for multiple classes, which is something I think we really need to be looking at a little bit more in education, especially when you're looking at the main reason most kids fail within our current grading environment is they're not doing enough work. Well, sure, they have 6 classes. They had 6 things to do. Like if I have 6 things to do when I go home, I do 1, like maybe 2 if I'm lucky, like, and I'm a full grown adult. So
yeah. I love to carry home a full briefcase and sit it down. Like that. Exactly. What am I going to do with that? I'm going to pick it up tomorrow morning. That's what I'm going to do with it. Yeah.
So that's one, like, how are they building? And honestly, if you're integrating multiple things, that's what I do in the real world. Like when I'm building something, I'm designing and I'm using geometry and I'm, calculating the cost of it. And it's like, I'm not just doing English here and doing that, it's all together. And so it'd be integrated projects. And then the coolest part to me that I've really been thinking about, and I think this is something a lot of teachers are processing as we return to the classroom this year, is like cramming 30 kids into a room with no option involved is going to lead to not the best learning environment. And, the Apollo School, one of the things that I think is awesome is, there are required times where kids go and meet with the teacher, maybe in small group sessions, but for the most part, classes are, the teacher says, hey, your project involves these 3 things. Here's when I'm teaching those things. Like it's happening at 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. and it's happening here and here. Kids basically sign up for what they need, and then they go to that class, right? Like, and it was just so cool for me to hear that is happening. Like, it's not like this dream that's never going to come true, but it's like, no, this exists. And as people are pulling it off, and, it requires kids have to be building something that they like. Because if I'm being forced to do something that I don't like, and someone's like, hey, do you want to learn more about that? I'm like, not at all. Like, I don't want to learn more about that at all.
I'll be in the cafeteria.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just be talking with my friends because there's no teacher there right now. Yeah. So that's it and for me, it's a big thing of like, it's a much more fluid understanding of how learning happens. Like it involves office hours where I'm working on something and I get stuck in the moment and I can go talk to somebody, or like how I use YouTube. Like I need to learn something. I know that I can go to this resource and learn it. And maybe that's what their class is they know I need to learn this. I go here and I learn it. So to me, I mean, that's my dream. And like, grade levels, I would love to let's get rid of grade levels.
Yeah, that is a horribly counterproductive thing. Like, I do understand why you don't necessarily want your 10th grade English student who's reading at a 3rd grade level. I understand why you don't put them in the same room as the 8-year-old. Like, I get that. Like, that is, that I get it. However, the idea that like we're going to progress through this and everyone's going to make X amount of progress when you're 14 years old and when you're 15 years old. And, we have so much social promotion going on for a variety of reasons that like just sort of throwing that piece out alone, I think would yield a lot of progress, because you could put kids in classes where they really fit sort of skill wise, what do I know? What do I need to learn? And it doesn't have to do with, am I approximately as tall as the other people around me? Like, that's really, we group people more by height than by ability in a lot of cases. And I don't know that that's productive. I mean, maybe psychologically in some ways it's useful, but it's really not necessarily good for learning. I love the interdisciplinary thing. I'm not going to, get us off track or bore you with this, but this is part of the, with the pandemic and having a little more time around the house, I started like making notes on like what my school would be. I hit a point where I'm like, I'm like 40, 50 episodes into this podcast. And I was like, I keep asking other people, I should probably figure it out beyond, I was like, interdisciplinary projects. You don't have an English project, a history project, a math project. We need like one project, maybe two, if you keep them small, that incorporate all of it. And then you can still go to the classes and learn the stuff. Like, I'm 100% with you there, but, I had a fun idea about like creating things that could be used in the community. And so if I'm going to build something, then you have to build it and either someone else wants it and you can install it, or we have a school shop and you can sell it, or like you can make a movie. Yeah. Cool. We're going to put it on our website and people are going to pay $2 to watch your movie. And like we're essentially, and then if you're like, no one watched my movie, or people watched it and gave it bad reviews, well, now I don't have to grade it because that it sucked. And so to sort of take those products and make them public facing, not that it has to be like a purely capitalist, like we're selling the students learning or whatever, but it really, instead of my least favorite word in education is authentic, because it almost never really means authentic. It just means like, hey, let's put on this pageant where it seems like it's more real, but it's not. And like, let's just make it real. Like, if you're going to make something that has a market value, like, let's go ahead and sell it. Or, oh, I have this great, let's use your idea, like let's put it into play. Whatever that outcome is, whether you actually do that or not, I think the interdisciplinary thing is really important because it gives the opportunity to actually both learn and use the learning in ways that reflect things that exist outside of school. Very few people have the job where like, I use this one skill set and that's all I do. You're doing a lot of different things, and it probably wouldn't even be that hard really to make that happen in a school. Like it's doable. Like you said, I haven't heard of that. I'll check out the Apollo School. I've got that one written down. So, all right. So we're going to wrap up here in a couple minutes. There's one other question. It was something that you had sort of hinted at as we were getting started. And you also hit on it a couple of times. You're like, as we get back into school and students are sort of reacclimating and things like that. And, I took a new job in the same school system this year where I'm working 100% online distance learning. And so I am all kinds of busy and stressed with just like, I'm in my 16th year. Last year, especially at the end of the year when we were back to in person, I could just walk into school and teach. Be like, are you ready? Ready for what? They have a book, they have paper. I know what to do. Like I could, I'm generally more prepared than that, but I could just do it. And the kids would generally not know the difference. It's going to go fine. When you're all online, everything's got to be prepped and planned, and it's got to all be input into the learning management system. So I've been really busy and stressed, but I have a lot of friends working at my former school and all over who have been not only saying that they're stressed and maybe under some personal or psychological sort of turmoil. I've heard a lot of people saying that they feel like this school year, 2021, 2022, has been harder than any year they've dealt with, including, say, being all online last year or, whatever, which I don't get, if we're being honest, but I think it's because I'm not in a building. But I know you mentioned like it's been a tough year for you. And I know that, you've taken a little, semi hiatus from Twitter, which is normally a place you're pretty active. And so I'm assuming they're related. Like, I guess you can be as personal as you want. Like, how is that feeling for you? Or if you want to sort of do it at the 10,000 foot view, what do you think is going on that's affecting teachers in the profession this year, say differently than in the past?
For me, this has been I generally hit a slump in October. It's just like you run into end of August, September with a lot of adrenaline and a full head of steam, and that wears off eventually. And this year it was like early October, way earlier than usual. And, I just figured I'd been an instructional coach teaching just one class the last 4 years. And I was just like, well, I kind of expected this. Like, I've got a full class load. I'm going to be exhausted. And then it didn't get better. It didn't get better. It kept kind of building and feeling worse and worse. And I actually just recently spent some time processing and writing about it, trying to figure out why, like I couldn't pinpoint why exactly it was worse. And I think one of the things that I really came back to that a lot of people are feeling is during the pandemic, when we were online, there was so much talk about like coming back better, right? Like this is difficult, but we're going to come back and things are going to be different and we're going to grow from this. And maybe there are some schools that have done some incredible things based on what they learned, but by and large, school is doubling down on what it used to be. And that's I think that's been hard for teachers, just hoping that it gets better. I think everybody, no matter like even the most jaded teachers, which sometimes I feel like I fit that category, we always there's hope that it's going to get better. And schools seem to have doubled down. Now I still really think like we have to name we're still in a pandemic. Like school is just trying to figure out how to make things function the way that it can right now. Like kids are out all the time for different reasons. Like that, I think the expectation that this year was going to be the year that it gets better is one that we have to let go of. This isn't the year that it's going to get better, and that's okay. Like this is the year that we're going to be here.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And I think that kind of leads to like, and this is going to get a little bit dark, but we're going to let it go pretty quick. But you get into the profession of teaching because you have hope for the future. And I think, that's part of why I got off social media. It's not just Twitter, but in general, I needed to take a break because we've all gotten so obsessed with doom scrolling. Like we spend all this time on social media and it feels like all we see are the bad things that are happening and how things are getting worse and worse and it's not getting better. And I think, talking with some colleagues at a really deep level, there are a lot of teachers who got into teaching to make the world a better place as kind of their goal and their purpose. And I think a lot of people are looking around going, how the heck is that happen? Like, how is that going to happen? Like my primary purpose. Yeah.
This is worse. This is definitely worse.
Yeah. And so, I will say like, I won't pretend that it's all sunshine and rainbows after a little bit. Like it's still rough, but I think we get so focused on the long term that sometimes we forget what's right in front of us. And I was definitely becoming guilty of that. Like this is a rough year and it's exhausting and it's difficult. And I don't think we should sugarcoat that or, we can't toxic positivity our way past that. Like we can't ignore it. But also like for me, I got so wrapped up in my head about the potential and what could happen that I was forgetting, like I've got today and I've got 30 kids in front of me and they're pretty fun and we can have a great day. And if today I make it a good day for those 30 kids and I don't know what's going to happen in the future, yeah, I might think about the future eventually, but I had a good day. Like I did the thing I love today. And I don't think we can always say that if we're not focusing on today. So I don't know. It's been rough. And I don't think it's not a solution.
No, but I mean, there's a degree of, I don't know. I'm big into, without being a person who say meditates a lot, I'm very into sort of my own brand of mindfulness. Like I'm a huge fan of like the Roman Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius's meditations, and then like jump to like Lao Tzu and go Taoism. And it's all the same thing. It's just like, there are things that you can influence and there are things that you can't. And if you put too much energy or time or thought into things that you can't, you will always feel bad about it. So you look at what you can do, and you do that. But sometimes we get in the situation where we start thinking we can do more than we actually can, or I'm trying to do the things that I think I could do, or I used to do, whatever, and I'm not getting the result, and it feels really defeating. I mean, I'm with you that the sort of the turnaround in the pandemic, in terms of what we could have done versus what we did, is probably the greatest disappointment I've had in my career. When I think like I've lost a lot of faith in people in leadership positions who talk about like, we're going to innovate, we're going to do this. I'm like, tell me again. You just had 2 years where you could have done literally anything. Like that first few months, like we lost the end of a school year. You could have done literally anything. Like, okay, we're going to do it online. Let's just let them all read a book. And then, you could turn school asynchronous and then have them work on a project and then do it. And you know what? No, it was like everything was so stripped down and limited. And then immediately the conversation became, how do we get back to normal? Like I just pulled it up. I don't know, like 2-3 different podcasts. Like most of these I talk with a guest, and every once in a while I just do one and I just, talk about something by myself for a little bit. I did like 2 or 3 throughout 2020, talking about how this was the greatest opportunity to innovate and change education and improve what we do. And I said, the great failure will be if everybody just decides we need to get back to normal as quickly as we can. And that's pretty much what's happened almost everywhere. And so like, for me, that's a source of my disappointment. But I also found, I don't want to say like an exit, but I'm now teaching in an brand new online program. That's not for everyone. It's a very small program. It's the first year, whatever. But so I think maybe one of the things that I'm not feeling that maybe people in the building are, is I am doing something new and my job did change because of it. But I think for a lot of people, it didn't. And when you get back to school and everyone's like, all right, we're getting back to normal may not have been that great in the first place. And when you come back with this high hopes of, all right, we're getting back to what I can do all these things. And like, I don't know, I get that it would feel different, and maybe that's the disconnect for me. Why I'm feeling it a little bit differently is because I did make that change, and maybe, so maybe that's it. But I've heard so many people talk about how this is the hardest year and feeling bad, just about their work or about the job, like feeling either they're doing a bad job or they feel like they're doing an okay job, but they're not feeling good about school. Maybe that's like, I don't know, everyone's freaking out about CRT or diverse books or, what a gender policy, like there's all these things that everyone's freaking out about. And like you said, you get into teaching. So I want to make the world better. And then when 95% of the talk you hear about schools and your job is negative, like that does not sound like things are getting better. How much, I mean, obviously the pandemic is a big part. Do you think that other stuff is creeping into the classroom in ways that are affecting people's sort of feeling about their job or the community support? Or is that very local? Like where I am, this is a hotbed, like Loudoun County is where we're on Fox News every night of the week at this point. Like it's ridiculous. But like in the rest of the country, do you think that that's a factor?
I don't notice it a ton in my school. I mean, I've got a couple like signs up in my classroom that have been questioned by the community a tiny bit, but I mean, I honestly think teachers are so overwhelmed with everything else right now that it's just that comes up and they're like, don't care, not pressing, not immediate right now. I'm going to survive if I ignore it.
That does not have a deadline on it. I am not. Yeah. No, it's a weird dynamic. It's like, it's a weird time to be in education. But to be fair, you could probably say that about a lot of jobs. Like it's just, maybe it's a weird time to be alive a little bit. But when your job is so focused on other people, and particularly young people who don't have a good frame of reference, it becomes really, tough. Like, when kids tell me something about like, oh, this is how I figure out what's normal or what I'm supposed to be doing. And I'm like, please don't look at me when you need to figure out what's normal, what you're supposed to be doing. Like I can fix your commas and make you more persuasive. Don't take it too far beyond that. All right. So we covered a bunch of stuff. And I mean, I think with the grading talk, I tried to keep that at a relatively broad level because there's a lot of details that, we could get into. And just I'll plug it again for anyone who's interested. You can check out Tyler's blog at teacher-totter.blogspot.com and on Twitter when you're there, when you're back. But there's tons of details in it. But I think before you worry about like the minutia of how do I do this thing or how many assignments go in the grade book, like I think you really got to sort of align the philosophy first and figure out like, what are you doing? What are you trying to do? And then you work out the details, sort of accordingly. Before I sort of ask you the final question, which is sort of the light and easy, recommendations for books and movies, is there anything that you want to mention or talk about, say quickly, that we didn't, or maybe something that we moved on from too fast? Anything you want to just put out there for the audience?
I think the only thing I would say for, wherever you're at in the journey, the question that's always helpful for me is, can I have a conversation with students about their learning and growth? Like wherever you're at, whatever you're doing, because I realized looking at my grade book way back when, like I still have a memory of walking my physical grade book down to the office to submit it and just looking at it and going like, this doesn't tell me anything. Like if I were to hand this to my next year's teacher and be like, here's what they need to know, they'd be like, so they're good at quizzes. This student missed a lot of tests, so like really, if you want to like, ask the question, can I even have the conversation with my students about learning and growth? And then look at your grade book with that question in mind. And if you're trying to figure out where to start, what to do, that's the question that always helps me kind of center back on, what do I need to be focusing on? What do I need to be doing?
That's awesome. Yeah. And I also just, as sort of a kind of a motif running through the conversation is how much of this is not just focused on students, but including students. And particularly, I mean, I think you can always do it, but especially as the students get older, some of this is easier to do, say at a high school level where the kids have certain frame of reference or some fundamental skills to use. But, getting students involved in that process, I think is super important. And so, yeah, if they can help you to identify what they need to know or what they're doing, not just, making them feel like they're part of the conversation, but actually using their input. Think about, I mean, how many times and I'm guilty of this, I used to be more guilty than I am now, but how many times I've had a student do like a reflection activity that I just check off and throw in a folder. No, like they just said what they got, what they didn't get. Like that's going to tell me more than what I just saw on their paper. I can't just throw that into their portfolio and be like, check, look at me, I'm doing portfolios, how fancy. Like, input that isn't used isn't really input. And that's maybe a tough thing to keep in practice. Look at me, I did portfolios. They're in the box over there. I have not read them.
Someone said that same thing to me one time of like, so basically if you just ask them what they need and then you don't do that, it's probably worse than just not asking them what they need in the first place, huh? And I was like, yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. That's my least favorite thing when someone says, hey, we want input. And then I offer input and I either hear nothing back or I get something back that's just like, thanks for contributing that. I'll pass it along. Yeah. And then nothing ever happens. I'm like, well, why I wasted 10 minutes coming up with that answer for you? Like, come on. Like,
thanks for telling me I'm not important. Yeah, that's what I took away from it.
Yes. I suspected it all along. No. All right. So last question. This is how I end all these. Couple of books and movies, one or the other. This can be professional or academic, or can purely be for interest. I have heard all kinds of weird stuff. Just what are some things that you like and that you think maybe the audience should check out?
Let's see. There are two books, one that I'm not even done with that I'm going to recommend. But the one that I have read and have read a couple times now, it's called The Willpower Instinct. By, I hope it's Kelly McGonigal when I say that out loud. I think that's the author. And I love it. I mean, it's this really cool look at willpower. And so often people use willpower or think about willpower as like, I'm saying no to things, right? Like I need to lose weight. I'm saying no to all these foods, blah, blah, blah. But she reframes it and really digs into kind of the psychology and just how our brain works, of looking at like, no, that's not going to work. Like if you're just saying no to the things that you think you want now, not going to work. You have to be thinking like, what am I saying yes to, right? Like, what am I actually pursuing? And then, oh, by the way, I'm not going to do this now. So, and that's the really, really, really brief version, but it's fantastic. Nice. The other version, I don't even know if I can swear. I won't swear on here, but it's Mark Manson.
Do it.
It's the subtle art of not giving a fuck, which I feel like right now a lot of teachers need to read. Like it's just, I needed to read it. I have been loving it, going through it. But it just, he makes a really good point. It's not apathy. It's not indifference. But it's letting go of the things that clutter our mind and frustrate us that aren't important. And we let kind of take over the things that really are important. So, I feel like those two things have very similar themes, but that's kind of what's been going through my head right now. And those have been fantastic books for me.
I like it. That's good. That, yeah. And it's funny. I've had both friends and coworkers who have either recommended or just spoken highly of the second. And they're like, you should read it. And I'm like, see, here's the thing. I'm really good at that already when I choose to be. Now, the thing I need help with is that sometimes I get so excited about so many things that I start to give a lot of F's about a lot of them, but it's almost always because I chose them. I'm like, I sleep less than almost anyone, but it's because I'm doing like 50 things that I really like. And they're like, you should care less about. I care zero about all the other stuff. It's for me, I need to get better at the streamlining piece. But yeah, no, I mean, definitely important to be able to keep some priorities and keep a good focus. And given, what we just talked about with maybe some of the struggles that a lot of teachers are facing, maybe not just good books in general, but maybe timely as well. Just for fun, pure personality piece. I don't want anything related to self-help or school. What's your favorite movie?
Oh man.
You can name two if it helps.
I love, there's a movie like it's called Lucky Number 11. And it's fantastic. Yeah. I am the worst person to watch movies with because I'm constantly guessing what's going to happen. And this was one of the few times that I looked like a complete idiot by the end of the movie. Like I love it. It's such good writing.
Yeah. I you know what? That's funny. I remember watching it. Is Bruce Willis?
Bruce Willis is in there.
Okay.
Is it Josh Hartnett? Is that his name?
Yeah, in there. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It was a while. I remember seeing that. I remember the same thing. I'm very good at keeping my mouth shut though. I'm the guy who like grumbles one thing early on and then the movie ends and I'm like, guys, seriously, you didn't see this coming. And then I get all snooty, like that was so stupid and obvious, and so I'm fine to watch the movie with you. Just probably don't want to talk with me afterwards. But yeah, you're right. I remember doing that and it ended. And I remember going like, no, I had no idea. I had no idea. So that's good. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, cool. There we go. All right. So again, we've been talking with Tyler Rablin, talking about a lot of stuff, but primarily about grading and assessment and feedback and sort of improving what we're doing in schools, but largely through that lens. You can find him at Mr_Rablin, Rablin, on Twitter and at teacher-totter .blogspot.com. He also hosts occasionally something called Brew EDU, which is sort of a half professional development, half happy hour of sorts. I don't know. And I mean, I assume I just saw you post on Twitter. I don't know how the first one, or if that was the first one, but I've now done two of these digitally and I love it. Like I now, like when you're like, yeah, we're going to do that. I'm like, I put on the family calendar. I'm like, wife and kids, you need to go find something to do because I'm going to go talk with some people about school. But as we wrap up, what was the inspiration for that?
Yeah, I really thought about some of my favorite ideas about teaching came from like a couple of us Friday after school went to our local brewery, grabbed a couple beers and we're talking shop. And I was like, well, why don't we just do this more often? So it became something we did in person for a little bit and then Zoom happened. And so we moved it to Zoom a little bit. And yeah, it's been, I mean, I feel like especially right now, we'll do another one. I was looking at a calendar sometime early November. I haven't pinned down a date yet.
No pressure here. It is fun. It's like, it's a very different vibe than a lot of say education discussions. But they've all been good, at least that I've been a part of. So yeah, very good.
They've been, I feel like just getting to sit down and talk with teachers and swap stories and share ideas. Like it's hard to walk away from that, not feeling happy.
Yeah, I love it. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been the ClassCast Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. You can find the ClassCast Podcast on all major streaming services, plus on YouTube and at classcastpodcast.com. You can also find us at ClassCast Pod on Twitter and at ClassCast Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. Hope everyone has a great day. Tyler, thank you again for talking.
Thank you.